I've got a very tense game to show you here. I thought it'd be appropriate to finish off my coverage of the Norway chess tournament with a game between the players who came first and second. So with the white pieces, Magnus Carlsen, with black, Alireza Firouzja. So this was played all the way back in round 2. If you remember in the classical game in round 2, it was a very exciting Queen's Gambit declined game that ended in a draw. And then they went on to play an Armageddon game, and that's the game I want to show you here. Do check out my video of the classical game. If you haven't seen that, it's really worth watching, actually. But this is the Armageddon game. So Carlsen had 10 minutes. Firouzja had 7 minutes. And of course, it's draw odds for black. And they get 1 second increment after move 40, so not very much. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. And do consider supporting us via Patreon or PayPal. Do check out the rewards on Patreon. Extra videos, newsletter, that kind of thing. So, it's a Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. Magnus Carlsen likes this with white. As I've mentioned many times previously, he does like these fixed structures. And he has a nice regular pawn structure here for white. This line with h6 has come into fashion over the past 10 years. I covered this on my Queen's Gambit DVD for ChessBase. It was always considered not to be best, actually, because this can leave black open to this attacking push. But there are ways to play it, and it's been discovered that actually, it's a useful move. In their classical game, Carlsen tried bishop d3. But here he went queen c2. And put the knight on f3. In the classical game, he put the knight on e2. So, standard stuff so far. And here black can play knight d7, but Firouzja went for knight e4, slamming the knight on the outpost. And this is a very decent way to play. If bishop takes knight, then you play bishop takes bishop on h4. And it was useful to have that pawn on h6, of course. There's no bishop takes pawn check. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes. You can see that the rook and the queen support the knight on the outpost. And, well, as a Queen's Gambit player with black, I think this is already fine, personally. I think with the knight here, you just need to bring those pieces across here, maybe bishop on f5. Castles is normal here, but Carlsen took on e4. And he's got something special in mind. He wanted to mix things up. Of course, as white in an Armageddon, he's in a must-win situation. So he wanted to try and destabilize the position. f5 holds on to that pawn. And here's his idea. Castle's queensides. He wants an unbalanced game. And you certainly get it with this, but frankly, I don't think this presents black with many difficulties, and just with some very straightforward moves, Firouzja gets, I think, a good position. You could just go knight a6 here and bishop e6, that's not bad. He went knight d7, also good. And here's Carlsen's idea. If he just sits there, then I think actually white's king doesn't stand very well. Knight f6, bishop e6, and black has a very easy pawn storm on the queen side. And I think in particular those light squares, that bishop could very easily come in to d3. So g4 from Carlsen. He wants to mix it up. So after pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn. Well, you could say from a very strict positional point of view, white has achieved something here. He's got rid of black's big central pawn, and he still has a nice structure here. But actually, this kind of pawn transaction is relatively common in the Queen's Gambit, and actually black is fine here. Threat bishop f5, pinning, so the knight goes back. And the reason black is fine is, well, first, very harmoniously placed pieces. They're working really nicely together. And second, this f-pawn is a huge problem, actually, for white. And, well, white's attempts to open up the king side are in vain at the moment, because actually these pawns prevent white from doing anything. Basically, Carlsen has to rely in the long term on perhaps pushing these centre pawns forward, but that is not easy when black is so well coordinated. Beautiful pieces. King b1, yep, the king has to be pushed to the side, otherwise it's vulnerable. And rook f8, excellent move. Just targeting the pawn on f2. And I think black has very easy play here. I mean, if white sits there, for example, rook e1, queen f7 is a nice move, pressure on this diagonal. And knight d5, you can see that knight might want to come in here. That a-pawn could advance if b3 comes. This is fun for black. Anyway, rook f8 has just been played. So Carlsen, well, he never likes to play passively. This is his big asset in the position, his central pawns, so he's looking to push them. Rook d8. Actually, they can be controlled very easily. Rook he1, and now queen f6. Well, I put lots of paint on the board here. You can see why. Basically, in pushing that e-pawn, you can see the d-pawn is now vulnerable, and the f2 pawn is under attack. Well, it's a simple double attack, and Firouzja wins a pawn. Carlsen started to improvise. Pawn to f4. I mean, it's even possible to take this, but Firouzja decided why not play pawn takes pawn en passant. It looks best. Gives himself a beautiful passed pawn. But Carlsen did this in order to secure this pawn, and well, it's well blockaded, this pawn. It's impossible for black to push the queen out of the way, nevertheless. And black is obviously better in this position and has beautiful pieces. It's classic Queen's Gambit. When it goes right for black, it looks really, well, classical, very straightforward. Queen h4, b3 knocks that annoying knight backwards, but it's on a good central square on d6. King b2. Now, if black wanted to really go for it, then you could push that b-pawn. That looks quite nice, because that knight is sort of holding up the centre. I mean, maybe Firouzja didn't want to sort of disturb his pawns, but b5 looks very tempting to me. And then to push here and play knight b5. White's king doesn't look very good here at all. You can imagine a scenario where black breaks through and, you know, there's a problem on this diagonal or the second rank, and that knight is ready to support any attack. So that looks pretty good. But Firouzja played rook f7 and simply protected that pawn, which is reasonable. I mean, it means that that queen is permanently tied to defending, to blockading on f2, and it's difficult for white to do anything here. Firouzja just playing very practically, just waiting for the moment. Rook f4, little bit of pressure here. You can see rook, queen and knight hitting that pawn, and now I would say he's ready to play b5, b4. Well, we know Carlsen never likes to wait around. He likes to play actively. So he pushed e5. But you can see once the pawn advances, then the squares around that pawn are a bit weaker. Black can occupy those squares. So, well, I guess you give something to get something. At least Carlsen gets a square for the knight. But this is simply good for black. You can see in these last two moves, the minor pieces occupying those squares. So what does Carlsen play here? The knight under attack, it's pretty bad. He played rook takes f3, and here, well, of course, already both players running very, very short of time. In fact, Firouzja took on g3, and it's a mistake. You need time to calculate here. He could have just played this and taken on h2 with check, so he's still a pawn up, and then taken on g3. That's maybe the trick that he missed. In fact, it's just a simple exchange. If knight takes, then bishop takes queen, and so queen takes here, and black is just a very safe pawn up in the endgame. That bishop is an absolute monster on d5. Connected past pawns, the king will come into the middle to deal with any threat to the e-pawn, any threat with the e-pawn, active rook. Winning position for black. But instead of rook takes rook, Firouzja played knight takes g3. Pawn takes, rook takes rook. And after this, well, they arrived at an endgame where pawns are even. A rook and pawn endgame, well, who was it who said all rook and pawn endgames are drawn? Well, yeah. I mean, it's certainly Carlsen is back in the game now. Even pawns. But black has the better chances. Or let's just say it's much easier for black to play this position. The rook is active. The king is about to come into the center to blockade that e-pawn. White's king is very poorly placed. You can see that rook does an excellent job of cutting the king. It's really poorly placed. So, well, if you look at a computer at this point, it says it's equal. Black is better though. Black has the better chances. King g8, excellent move. So that king will blockade the e-pawn. So white's king has to go the long way round to activate. And I think it's obvious that that's a handicap for white. So Carlsen desperately trying to find play here. King e6, good move, centralized. a5, rook g3. Now it's getting critical. Of course, it's getting critical at a moment when the players are down to their final seconds. It was from this moment on, well, if you can find a video clip of the finish of this game, you'll see that it was absolutely frantic. And in such endgames, you need to calculate. There is no substitute for calculation, and they just didn't have the time to do that. They're just guessing here. Carlsen played a6. Well, whoops, that was a misfire. He played a6, and he's hoping, of course, that the pawns will be broken, and then the king can go in and start menacing those pawns. In fact, the best move is to play king c4 here. But Carlsen was obviously wary of rook g4. This is what Firouzja has been aiming at, which will force an endgame. In fact, this pawn endgame should end in a draw, but you can't tell that at a glance. Basically, it's going to end like this. And here, well, and the king gets back to cover this pawn, and it's a draw. So king c4 is the best move, basically. But Magnus played a6, and now b6. Now it's not so clear again. Of course, it's nice to have that pawn on a6 for when the rook potentially gets around to attack this pawn. But now there's a problem. Carlsen should play here rook f4 and come in. Instead he played, and he's worse after this. But with the active rook, he should be able to hold that position. But instead he played king c4. And after rook g4, now this is a different story compared to the line we looked at previously. Here, rook takes rook is winning for black. And the reason is that black has gained a tempo here. Let's just see why. Why and how. So the king comes over. Now you play c5. And in this case, black is winning by a tempo. There you go. You can see that one is going through faster than this one. Okay, let's go back. So rook g4 played. So now it's getting critical for Carlsen, but he went into overdrive at this moment. He was playing so quickly, and Firouzja was nervous. You can see that in his play. He's just kind of somehow all over the place physically, whereas Carlsen just looked really focused. That is his strength. Here, c5 is a really strong move. I mean, it's actually the same as the pawn endgame if this is taken. And here the rook has to retreat. And then just rook takes pawn, and black is winning that position. So c5 would have been excellent. But instead, rook g3 check. Rook e3. The pawn endgame is actually a draw if rook takes rook. And after rook g4, well, of course, rook e4 would repeat the position. Carlsen can't do that. He would lose the Armageddon. He goes for rook f3. So with a6, he's just created a little something in the position. So if rook takes pawn, then the rook is going to come in and round take a7. Then it's interesting again. So c5 from Firouzja. So he wants to ensure that that rook can come across perhaps at some moment to defend or maybe cover. Rook f8, king takes e5, rook f7, and here Firouzja lost on time. He was just kind of all over the place. It should still be a draw, but now it's getting tricky. Let's just have a quick look at what should happen here. Rook takes pawn on h4, rook takes a7, check. The rook comes back, needs to defend against that a pawn. King c4, g5, rook h7, king takes c5. Now it's very scary. In fact, it's still a draw. This is just a sample line, but let me just show you, well, something that could be typical. When it turns into a race, you need to calculate precisely. And here, this should be a draw. If g4, then the rook will go behind, and that's winning for white. But king g7, that's a very typical idea. When you're trying to push your pawns, you stop this rook coming behind on g8 and h8. And now the rook has a problem, because if two pawns get to the 6th rank, they're winning. So check. King g6, still preventing the rook coming here. Rook b8. The rook wants to get behind again. And king g7, you can see that's a draw by repetition. Now that's actually a very typical scenario in these kind of positions. 3-4 repetition, as the computer says, exactly. So anyway, that's all irrelevant because here Firouzja lost on time. Carlsen once again pulled through with incredible focus, incredible determination. And I think that marked out his play in the tournament as ever. He said afterwards, he wrote in a tweet, there certainly were some positive moments, but mostly I felt pretty clueless throughout the tournament. Even long thinks generally resulted in guesses. Nevertheless, happy to be playing over the board and classical again, and a huge thanks to the organiser for making it possible and safe for us. Don't know when I'll be playing classical tournaments again. but I'll be eagerly awaiting the opportunity and try to improve. Well, there was someone that commented on that tweet and said that's kind of a bit of a humble brag. I love that word, humble brag. I know what he means, but actually, Carlsen is really self-critical. He's always striving to improve and do his best. There you go. I really enjoyed it. And, well, going along with what Carlsen said, it's fantastic to have classical over-the-board chess again. I'm fed up with all this cheating nonsense online, all the rumours, dreadful stuff. It's great to see over-the-board chess again. Thanks for watching.